James Miller lived a simple life in the small, sleepy town of Auburn Ridge, nestled in the Midwestern United States. Auburn Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where kids still played in front yards, and neighbors exchanged nods as they went about their day. James, a retired elementary school principal, spent most mornings jogging around the town, his old yet reliable legs carrying him along familiar paths lined with elms and oaks. Auburn Ridge was his home, and James was as much a part of it as the historic courthouse in the town square. At 66, James was in good health, a point of pride for him, especially since he still kept up with his old friend and neighbor, Thomas Gray. They'd both grown up here, watched each other grow old, and had formed a tradition of meeting for coffee at least once a week at Charlotte's Diner. On days when James wasn't at the diner with Thomas, he could be found pottering around his yard or in his modest woodworking shed, a structure he built with his own hands on the corner of his property. James' wife, Lillian, was his world. She'd always been the center of his quiet life, their marriage reaching a rare stability that others admired. She was warm, down to earth, and practical, even if her beauty had softened over the years into crow's feet and a few extra pounds. James loved her warmth, her laughter, and the way she could ease his worries with a simple, reassuring look. Their two grown children had moved to neighboring states for work, but visited frequently with their own families, filling the house with the noise of grandkids and laughter. On a particularly crisp autumn morning, as James came back from his run, he noticed Thomas driving by in his old green pickup truck. Thomas gave him a nod and a strange, knowing smile. Something about that grin struck James as odd, even unsettling. It lingered in his mind as he watched the truck disappear around the corner. The odd feeling grew as James approached his house, spotting Lillian heading from the garage back inside. The garage, with its sturdy oak doors and perfectly organized shelves, was James' pride. He built it himself, transforming it from a dusty storage space into a place where he parked his meticulously maintained Ford Mustang, a car that had seen better days but that James cherished like an old friend. Inside, James found Lillian moving about the kitchen, starting breakfast. She looked up, a bit startled, as he entered, but smiled, kissing him lightly on the cheek. "You're up early," he remarked, noting that she usually stayed in bed a little longer on Saturdays. "Oh, I couldn't sleep," she said with a sheepish smile, shrugging it off as if it was no big deal. "I thought I'd get an early start." As James went to shower, he brushed off his unease, chalking it up to his imagination. They'd been married for almost 40 years, a span marked by small ups and downs but filled with love and commitment. He'd always been grateful for her, seeing himself as the luckiest man in Auburn Ridge. When he came downstairs, the kitchen was buzzing with life. Their daughter, Emily, was there with her husband, along with their teenage son, Jake, and his fiancée, Sarah. Lillian was in her element, fussing over everyone, making sure everyone had food on their plates and coffee in their cups. Breakfasts with family were one of James' favorite parts of life. They filled the house with warmth and joy, a welcome reminder that despite the calm of retirement, he was still surrounded by loved ones. Emily's young son, Max, climbed onto James' lap as he dug into his pancakes, asking questions about everything he could see outside the window. He had his grandfather's curiosity, and James loved their little conversations, feeling like he was passing along a part of himself to the next generation. After breakfast, James planned to take Max to the town park, where they'd go fishing in the small lake, just as he'd done with Emily and his son, Matthew, years ago. It was a perfect day for it, the crisp autumn air and soft sun creating a picturesque backdrop. As James and Max drove through Auburn Ridge, he glanced over at the house of his neighbor, Laura Hayes, a sweet woman who'd lost her husband years ago. He noticed a new face working in her yard, a man with a broad, muscular frame, unfamiliar and out of place among the familiar faces of the town. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Max asked, noticing James's distracted expression. "Nothing, buddy," he replied, his eyes still lingering on the man. "Just something new around here." As they parked by the lake and set up their fishing rods, James felt the earlier unease return. He tried to shake it off as he and Max enjoyed their quiet fishing trip, with Max eagerly pointing out every small splash in the water, convinced that he was about to catch the biggest fish in the lake. James smiled, letting the boys' excitement chase away the troubling thoughts, at least for a while. When they returned home, Max ran off to share the news of their small catches with his mom and grandma. James, meanwhile, decided to stroll around his property, something he often did after a long day. As he passed by the garage, a thought struck him. He hadn't checked on his Mustang today. It wasn't just a car to him. It was a symbol of years of work and care, a piece of him. He unlocked the garage and stepped inside, the familiar scent of motor oil and polished leather welcoming him. Everything seemed in place, his tools neatly arranged on the walls, his workbench clear, and the car just as he'd left it. Yet something was off, something he couldn't put his finger on. A faint smell lingered in the air, one that didn't belong. He shrugged it off again, reminding himself that he was probably just overthinking things. Age, he thought, made people suspicious sometimes, even when there was no need. That evening, as they lay in bed, James' mind wandered to the strange smile Thomas had given him that morning. He wanted to bring it up, but Lillian was already asleep, her breathing soft and steady. He decided not to dwell on it. Maybe it was just one of those quirks of aging, the odd suspicions that crept into the mind without reason. Closing his eyes, James allowed the familiar comfort of their home to wash over him. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite as they seemed. The following week passed in a familiar, comfortable routine. James continued his morning runs, his afternoon woodworking, and his quiet evenings with Lillian. The weather was growing colder, and with it, the bright colors of autumn were beginning to fade into the muted tones of late November. Life in Auburn Ridge slowed down this time of year, leaving plenty of time for thoughts to drift, and for little things to gnaw at James' mind. One morning, while heading back from a jog, he spotted Thomas again, this time at the end of their street, sitting in his truck and looking over at James's house. Thomas wasn't alone. Next to him was the same muscular man James had seen before in Laura Hayes' yard. The man was speaking, gesturing toward James' property. James felt a twist in his gut, but he couldn't say why. He was too far away to hear. But there was something unsettling about seeing his lifelong friend with a stranger, pointing toward his house as if discussing something important. By the time he made it to his driveway, the truck had moved on, but the sight left him uneasy. Why would Thomas be with a stranger, talking about his property? They'd been friends since childhood. If something was going on, Thomas would have mentioned it. But he hadn't. That night, James decided to bring it up to Lillian as they sat together, reading by the fireplace. "You ever feel like people are changing around here?" he asked casually, hoping to make sense of the odd incidents without seeming paranoid. Lillian looked up from her book, a puzzled smile on her face. "Changing how?" He shrugged. "Just noticed Thomas with someone I didn't recognize, and it looked like they were talking about our place." Lillian chuckled, setting her book down. "Oh, James, you and your conspiracy theories. Thomas has always been a little eccentric, remember? He's probably helping Laura out with her yard or planning some surprise. I bet it's nothing." Her words should have reassured him, but instead he felt a small pang of irritation. Lillian often brushed off his concerns like this, just as she'd done through the years, treating his worries as a quirk. He forced a smile, though, and let it go. After all, she was right. Thomas was an odd character, and what harm could come from a neighborly favor? However, the next morning, James found himself lying awake long before sunrise. Lillian slept beside him, her breathing deep and even, but his mind churned with unease. Unable to shake it, he got up, dressed, and went downstairs. The garage door caught his eye. He hadn't looked closely at the place in days, and there was that strange smell from before. He walked over and opened the door slowly, the quiet creak of the hinges echoing in the cold morning air. He stepped inside and flicked on the light, scanning the room. Everything was where it should be. Tools neatly hung, the Mustang gleaming as it always did. Yet his eyes were drawn to the ground, to a faint, dark stain near the driver's side of the car. He knelt, running a finger across it. It was dry, barely noticeable, but something about it seemed out of place. As he stood up, his eyes caught a small, folded piece of paper wedged under the windshield wiper. Puzzled, he opened the car door and grabbed it. The note was simple and written in rough handwriting. Asterisk, does she know? Asterisk. James' breath caught in his throat. He read it again, his hands trembling slightly. Who had left this? What did it mean? Shoving the note in his pocket, he turned and hurried back inside, glancing around the street as he did. No one was out yet, and the quiet calm of the morning felt suddenly oppressive, as if the whole world was holding its breath. In the kitchen, he poured himself a cup of coffee and tried to make sense of what he'd found. The note could mean anything, he told himself. Maybe it wasn't even meant for him. Could have been left by a neighbor or one of the kids playing a prank. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Later that day, when Lillian left to run errands, James took out the note again. The words nagged at him, a strange warning that seemed to come from nowhere. He considered talking to Thomas, but something held him back. It felt as if this was a secret he was meant to uncover on his own. The week crawled by, his mind unable to let go of the strange events. The stay in the garage, the note, Thomas with the stranger. Everything felt connected, though he couldn't piece it together. Lillian noticed his quiet distraction and tried to reassure him, but her words felt distant, as if she wasn't really seeing him. One evening after she'd gone to bed, James decided he needed answers. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside, heading back to the garage. He examined every corner, looking for anything out of place, any sign of intrusion. After a thorough inspection, he found nothing. Everything was in perfect order. But just as he was about to give up, he noticed something near the edge of the garage wall, wedged into a crack in the wooden frame, a small, delicate silver bracelet. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It was a simple, elegant piece, clearly not new but well cared for. He recognized it immediately. It was Lillian's. She rarely wore jewelry around the house, and he hadn't seen her with this bracelet in years. A wave of confusion washed over him. Why would her bracelet be in the garage? She had no reason to be out here on her own, and yet there it was. He slipped it into his pocket and turned off the flashlight, his heart racing. In the dim light of their bedroom, he watched Lillian as she slept, the faint light casting soft shadows across her face. He wanted to wake her, to ask her about the bracelet, but a gnawing sense of doubt held him back. It was as if he was afraid of the answer, afraid of breaking the fragile trust that had held their life together for so long. The next day, while out for his run, he spotted Thomas again, this time in the park. Mustering his courage, he approached him. The two men exchanged pleasantries, and for a moment, it felt like old times, like nothing had changed. But as they talked, James felt that strange unease return. He decided to confront Thomas directly. "You were with someone last week," he said, keeping his voice casual. "Who was that?" Thomas hesitated, his smile faltering for just a moment before he shrugged. "Oh, just a friend. Helping out Laura with her place. Nothing big." James nodded, but the doubt lingered. "You mentioned my place?" Thomas chuckled, but it felt forced. "James, you've got a fine property. We were just admiring it. Don't think too much of it." The words were meant to reassure him, but they did the opposite. James walked away from the conversation feeling as if he'd just been lied to. The note, the bracelet, the stranger, everything pointed to something he couldn't yet understand, but that was close, just beyond reach. Over the next few days, James found himself watching Lillian, trying to catch any sign, any change in her. She was the same as always, kind and thoughtful. But his mind betrayed him, filling him with questions he was afraid to ask. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Lillian looked at him with a warmth that should have been reassuring. But James felt only doubt. The note in his pocket was a constant reminder, a warning that gnawed at him, making him question everything he thought he knew about his life, his wife, and the quiet town he'd always trusted. Days passed, but the quiet paranoia in James's mind grew louder. Each moment alone, he found himself returning to the bracelet, to the note, to every strange detail he had noticed recently. Auburn Ridge, his home for so many years, felt alien to him now, a place filled with secrets. He found himself moving through the days on edge, glancing over his shoulder, wondering if someone else in town could see the signs he was noticing, or if maybe he was the only one left out. One evening, unable to keep his thoughts to himself any longer, he confronted Lillian after dinner. "Lil, I found something in the garage," he started, his voice calm, but his heart pounding. "It was your bracelet, the one with the silver charm." Lillian looked up from her book, surprise flickering across her face. "My bracelet?" She put down the book, frowning. "I didn't even realize it was missing. I haven't worn that thing in years." Her response sounded natural enough, but James felt his suspicions stir. "You don't remember going to the garage at all recently?" She shook her head, looking genuinely puzzled. "No, I don't even go in there unless you ask me to bring something. Are you sure it's mine?" "Positive," he replied, holding her gaze. "I bought it for you on our 15th anniversary." Lillian gave him a soft smile, leaning over to squeeze his hand. "James, you're worrying too much. You probably just found it after all these years, tucked away somewhere. Maybe it fell from one of your tool drawers." James nodded, forcing himself to return her smile. It was a reasonable explanation, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, he lay awake long after Lillian had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence his thoughts. The bracelet, the note, each clue circled his mind like vultures. He knew it wasn't paranoia anymore, something was wrong, and he had to find out what. The next morning, James decided to take a more direct approach. After Lillian left to visit a friend across town, he drove to Thomas' place. As he approached the house, he saw Thomas working on his truck in the driveway, wiping his hands with an oily rag. When he noticed James, his face brightened, but James could see the tension in his friend's eyes. "Hey, James, what brings you by?" Thomas called out, his voice cheerful but strained. James took a deep breath. "I need to ask you something, Thomas, and I want the truth." Thomas's smile faded slightly, and he folded his arms, waiting. "What is it? Who was that man with you the other day? And why were you both looking over at my house?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his boots. "James, I didn't want to get involved. I thought it would be better if you didn't know." James' pulse quickened. Didn't know what? His friend looked away, struggling to find the right words. Finally, he sighed, meeting James's gaze. "The man you saw, his name's Leo. He's been, well, seeing Lillian. I don't know how long, but they've been meeting at Laura's place." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He felt as if the world had tilted beneath him, leaving him off balance and struggling to comprehend. "Lillian? His Lillian?" He forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Why didn't you tell me, Thomas?" Thomas looked pained, his mouth twisting into a grimace. "I wanted to, believe me. But I didn't want to be the one to destroy your family. I thought if I left it alone, maybe it would all blow over. But then, she started coming over more often." James took a step back, feeling the air leave his lungs. The images that had haunted him, the note, the bracelet, each one felt like a shard of glass driving deeper into him. "So you just let it happen? Let me walk around blind?" Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, a sad, resigned look in his eyes. "I didn't know what else to do, James. I'm sorry." James couldn't bear to look at him. He turned and walked back to his car, gripping the wheels so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't drive home immediately. Instead, he drove to the lake on the edge of town, parking near the water and sitting in silence. His mind raced, running through memories of Lillian, their life together, their laughter, their quiet moments. How could she do this to him? And why? He felt like a fool, a man who had devoted his life to someone who had been hiding a secret all along. After what felt like hours, he finally returned home. Lillian was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album, a peaceful smile on her face as she reminisced over their shared history. "Hey, honey," she said, looking up with a gentle smile. "Did you have a good day?" James couldn't bring himself to respond, to look her in the eye without his anger bubbling over. He made an excuse about being tired and went straight to their room, leaving her puzzled in the kitchen. Over the next few days, James's silence grew heavier. He spent hours in the garage, avoiding conversation, struggling to find answers within himself. The note continued to haunt him, an echo of his own doubts, and the bracelet was a silent reminder of the betrayal he had uncovered. One afternoon, while Lillian was out, James decided to confront the truth head-on. He drove to Laura Hayes' house, hoping to see the man who had upended his life. He parked down the street and waited, his heart pounding. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he saw a car pull into Laura's driveway. A tall, muscular man stepped out, glancing around before heading toward the house. It was the same man he'd seen with Thomas, a man who looked out of place in Auburn Ridge, as if he'd come from a different world altogether. James felt a surge of anger rise within him. He stepped out of his car, watching as the man disappeared inside Laura's house. After a few moments, he knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet. Laura answered, her expression turning worry when she saw him. "James, what are you doing here?" "I need to see Leo," he said, his voice firm. "I know about him. About him and Lillian." Laura's face fell, a mix of guilt and sympathy flickering across her features. She hesitated, then nodded, disappearing back into the house. A moment later, Leo appeared at the door. He was younger than James, with a confident stance and a faint smirk that made James's anger flare. They stood in silence, each one sizing the other up. "What do you want?" Leo finally asked, his tone casual, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. James clenched his fists, struggling to control his rage. "I want you to stay away from my wife." Leo chuckled, crossing his arms. "Your wife? She didn't seem to care about that last time we met." James felt his control slipping. Without thinking, he lunged at Leo, grabbing his collar and pulling him close, his voice a furious whisper. "I don't care what she told you. This ends now." Leo didn't resist, simply looked him dead in the eye with a mocking smile. "Maybe if you were a better husband, you wouldn't be here now, begging me to leave her alone." James released him, stepping back as the weight of his words sank in. It was a cruel taunt, but one that cut him deeply, because he couldn't shake the possibility that it was true, that he'd somehow failed her, failed to see the cracks in their life before it was too late. He walked away without another word, leaving Leo and Laura standing in the doorway. The drive home was a blur, his mind racing with anger, regret, and a pain he could hardly bear. When he got back, he found Lillian waiting for him, a worried look on her face. "James, where were you?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, taking in the woman he had loved for so long, the woman he had trusted with everything. "I know, Lillian. I know about Leo." Her face paled, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, the truth hanging heavily between them. He waited for her to speak, to give him an explanation, but all she could manage was a single word, spoken so softly he almost missed it. "I'm sorry." But those words were not enough to undo the betrayal, nor to heal the wounds it had left behind. Lillian's apology hung in the air, almost swallowed by the thick silence that followed. James stared at her, feeling a strange mix of rage, disbelief, and a hollow emptiness. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he found his voice. "How long?" he asked, each syllable heavy with the weight of years spent together. Lillian looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "About a year," she whispered. James felt as if he'd been punched. A year? That meant all those quiet nights, those weekends spent with family, those moments they'd shared, each one had been a lie. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm, though he could feel the anger bubbling inside him, ready to explode. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was wrong with us?" Lillian looked down, tears pooling in her eyes. "It wasn't about us, James. It was... I don't even know how to explain it. I felt trapped. Not by you," she added quickly, seeing the hurt in his eyes. but by everything. Our life here, the same routines, the same faces. I felt like I was disappearing. James' jaw tightened. So to feel alive again, you started seeing Leo, and everyone knew but me. She flinched. I didn't plan it. It just happened. Leo came to town. We ran into each other at Laura's. He listened, James. He made me feel like I was something more than just a wife and mother. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. He thought they'd built a life together, a home filled with love and stability. But it seemed she had wanted something else, something he couldn't give. "And what about me, Lillian?" he said, his voice growing harsher. "Wasn't I enough?" Lillian's shoulders slumped. "It was never about you. It was about me and the things I thought I'd lost. I didn't think you'd understand." James stood there, numb, unable to comprehend the betrayal. How could the person he'd loved, the woman he built his life with, suddenly seem like a stranger? "I need some time," he said, barely managing to hold his emotions in check, "to think about everything." Lillian's voice broke as she called after him, but he didn't look back. He went upstairs, grabbed his coat, and left the house, the walls feeling too close, too heavy, as if they were pressing down on him, suffocating him. He didn't know where he was going. His feet led him down familiar streets, past houses of people he'd known for decades, people who must have seen the cracks in his life long before he had. How many of them had watched him walk by with knowing smiles, with pity in their eyes? Eventually, he found himself at the edge of town, at the small overlook that Auburn Ridge residents called Evil's Point. It was a spot he'd come to often in his youth, a place where he could think clearly, where the town below looked like a tiny model, a miniature life that he could step back from, observe from a distance. He stood there for what felt like hours, watching the sun sink below the horizon, casting a fiery glow across the sky. He let the cool evening air clear his mind, steady his emotions. When he finally felt calm enough to return home, the town was quiet, the streets empty. Back at the house, the lights were still on, and Lillian was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine untouched in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her face pale and drawn. "James," she started, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "I don't want to talk tonight, Lillian," he said, his voice flat. "I need to sleep. We can figure things out tomorrow." He could see the disappointment in her eyes, the regret, but he felt too numb to care. Without another word, he went upstairs, leaving her alone. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories of their life together playing in his mind like a film. Every smile, every shared laugh, every quiet moment, they all felt tainted now, as if each memory had been rewritten with new, darker meaning. He wondered if he'd ever be able to see her the same way again. The next morning, they both moved around the house like strangers, avoiding each other's gaze. It was a painful silence, and James could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. After breakfast, he sat down across from her, folding his hands on the table. "I need to know everything, Lillian. Every detail. If there's any hope of us moving forward, I need the truth." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "All right, James." Over the next hour, she told him everything. About the chance meeting at Laura's, about the first few months of friendship, and how it had turned into something more. She admitted that Thomas had known, that Laura had suspected, and that she had convinced herself James would never find out. "I never thought it would go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I told myself it was just a phase, that I'd come back to you, that I'd fix things. But every time I tried, I felt more lost." James listened in silence, his heart breaking with each word. It was a story he'd never imagined, one he would have never believed if he hadn't seen the signs himself. And as she spoke, he felt something shift inside him, a coldness, a resolve he hadn't known he was capable of. When she finished, they sat in silence, the weight of her confession pressing down on them. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Lillian," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not after everything, but I also don't know if I can just walk away." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "I'll do anything, James. I want to make things right." He shook his head, feeling a bitterness he'd never felt before. Right now, I don't think there is a way to make things right. You tore our life apart, Lillian. For what? A thrill? To feel alive again? We had a good life, and you threw it away. She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. But James felt no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. Instead, he stood up, a sense of finality settling over him. I need time to figure out what I want, he said, turning toward the door. And until then, I don't want you here. Pack your things. Stay with one of your friends. I don't care who. I just need space. Lillian looked up, shock and pain on her face. James, please, don't do this. Let me stay. Let me show you I can make this right. But he was already walking away, the sound of her pleas fading behind him as he went upstairs, closing the door firmly behind him. Over the next few days, Lillian packed her things and left. She tried to reach out to him, sending messages, calling, but James didn't respond. He let her leave, watching her drive away from the house they had built together, from the life they'd shared. For the first time in his life, he was alone. At first, the solitude was unbearable. Each room in the house held memories, echoes of the life they'd built, reminders of everything he had lost. But as the days passed, he began to find comfort in the silence. He spent hours in his woodworking shed, carving away his frustration, his sadness, finding solace in the simple act of creation. Gradually, a new sense of purpose grew within him. He wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing. He was done living in the shadow of Lillian's betrayal. James Miller lived a simple life in the small, sleepy town of Auburn Ridge, nestled in the Midwestern United States. Auburn Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where kids still played in front yards, and neighbors exchanged nods as they went about their day. James, a retired elementary school principal, spent most mornings jogging around the town, his old yet reliable legs carrying him along familiar paths lined with elms and oaks. Auburn Ridge was his home, and James was as much a part of it as the historic courthouse in the town square. At 66, James was in good health, a point of pride for him, especially since he still kept up with his old friend and neighbor, Thomas Gray. They'd both grown up here, watched each other grow old, and had formed a tradition of meeting for coffee at least once a week at Charlotte's Diner. On days when James wasn't at the diner with Thomas, he could be found pottering around his yard or in his modest woodworking shed, a structure he built with his own hands on the corner of his property. James' wife, Lillian, was his world. She'd always been the center of his quiet life, their marriage reaching a rare stability that others admired. She was warm, down to earth, and practical, even if her beauty had softened over the years into crow's feet and a few extra pounds. James loved her warmth, her laughter, and the way she could ease his worries with a simple, reassuring look. Their two grown children had moved to neighboring states for work, but visited frequently with their own families, filling the house with the noise of grandkids and laughter. On a particularly crisp autumn morning, as James came back from his run, he noticed Thomas driving by in his old green pickup truck. Thomas gave him a nod and a strange, knowing smile. Something about that grin struck James as odd, even unsettling. It lingered in his mind as he watched the truck disappear around the corner. The odd feeling grew as James approached his house, spotting Lillian heading from the garage back inside. The garage, with its sturdy oak doors and perfectly organized shelves, was James' pride. He built it himself, transforming it from a dusty storage space into a place where he parked his meticulously maintained Ford Mustang, a car that had seen better days but that James cherished like an old friend. Inside, James found Lillian moving about the kitchen, starting breakfast. She looked up, a bit startled, as he entered, but smiled, kissing him lightly on the cheek. "You're up early," he remarked, noting that she usually stayed in bed a little longer on Saturdays. "Oh, I couldn't sleep," she said with a sheepish smile, shrugging it off as if it was no big deal. "I thought I'd get an early start." As James went to shower, he brushed off his unease, chalking it up to his imagination. They'd been married for almost 40 years, a span marked by small ups and downs but filled with love and commitment. He'd always been grateful for her, seeing himself as the luckiest man in Auburn Ridge. When he came downstairs, The kitchen was buzzing with life. Their daughter, Emily, was there with her husband, along with their teenage son, Jake, and his fiancée, Sarah. Lillian was in her element, fussing over everyone, making sure everyone had food on their plates and coffee in their cups. Breakfasts with family were one of James' favorite parts of life. They filled the house with warmth and joy, a welcome reminder that despite the calm of retirement, he was still surrounded by loved ones. Emily's young son, Max, climbed onto James' lap as he dug into his pancakes, asking questions about everything he could see outside the window. He had his grandfather's curiosity, and James loved their little conversations, feeling like he was passing along a part of himself to the next generation. After breakfast, James planned to take Max to the town park, where they'd go fishing in the small lake, just as he'd done with Emily and his son, Matthew, years ago. It was a perfect day for it, the crisp autumn air and soft sun creating a picturesque backdrop. As James and Max drove through Auburn Ridge, he glanced over at the house of his neighbor, Laura Hayes, a sweet woman who'd lost her husband years ago. He noticed a new face working in her yard, a man with a broad, muscular frame, unfamiliar and out of place among the familiar faces of the town. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Max asked, noticing James's distracted expression. "Nothing, buddy," he replied, his eyes still lingering on the man. "Just something new around here." As they parked by the lake and set up their fishing rods, James felt the earlier unease return. He tried to shake it off as he and Max enjoyed their quiet fishing trip, with Max eagerly pointing out every small splash in the water, convinced that he was about to catch the biggest fish in the lake. James smiled, letting the boys' excitement chase away the troubling thoughts, at least for a while. When Friday arrived, he drove to Laura's house, the familiar ache in his chest returning as he approached. Laura answered the door, a somber look on her face. "She's waiting for you in the back room," she said, stepping aside to let him in. He found Lillian seated at the small kitchen table, looking worn, as if she'd aged years since he last saw her. She looked up as he entered, her face a mix of regret and relief. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, motioning for him to sit across from her. He took a seat, his eyes fixed on her. "You said you had something to tell me, so tell me, Lillian." She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands. "James, I know you'll never forgive me for what I did. I don't expect you to. But there's something I couldn't tell you before, something I've been hiding." His stomach twisted, but he kept his face impassive. "Go on." "Leo, he wasn't just someone I met by chance," she began, her voice trembling. He's my half-brother." The words hit him like a sledgehammer, and for a moment he couldn't process what she'd said. "What? Your half-brother? What are you talking about?" Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "My mother had an affair before I was born. Leo is the result. I didn't find out until after we were married. She told me on her deathbed. I was ashamed, and I never told you. I only reconnected with him a year ago. But he made it clear he wanted more from me than a sisterly relationship." James' jaw tightened, his heart pounding. "So you just, what, gave in?" She shook her head. "It wasn't like that. I didn't want it, but he threatened to tell you everything, to ruin our family. I thought I could control it, keep him at a distance. But he wouldn't stop. I was afraid." James stared at her, feeling as if the ground beneath him was shifting. He wanted to be angry, but there was something in her voice, an edge of desperation, of fear, that made him pause. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Why didn't you trust me?" Lillian looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't want to lose you, James. I was ashamed. I thought I could handle it on my own. But Leo," he kept pushing, and I was too weak to stop him. The anger he felt, the betrayal, it all shifted, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. Lillian had been caught in her own lies, trapped by her shame and fear, and he had been the one to suffer the consequences. They sat in silence, the weight of her confession settling between them. Finally, James spoke, his voice steady but filled with pain. "Lillian, I don't know if I can forgive you." But I can't hate you either. I just wish you trusted me enough to tell me the truth from the start." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I wish I had too, James." With that, he stood, feeling a strange sense of closure. The woman he'd loved for so long had been taken from him, not by betrayal alone, but by secrets that had slowly poisoned their marriage. As he walked out of Laura's house, he felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an understanding, an end to the hurt that had consumed him. In the days that followed, James focused on himself, finding solace in the simple routines of his life. He still wasn't sure if he'd ever fully heal, but he knew he'd taken the first step. And for now, that was enough. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm for James. Auburn Ridge, with its quiet streets and familiar faces, seemed like a different place after everything he'd gone through. The pain that had once felt all-consuming had dulled into a distant ache, something he could manage as he took each day step by step. Lillian hadn't tried to contact him since their last meeting at Laura's house, and he hadn't reached out to her. They both seemed to understand that the best path forward was separate. The house, once full of shared memories, felt like his again, a place where he could rebuild, reshape his life according to his own terms. He continued his work in the woodshop, taking on custom projects from neighbors and even a few clients from out of town. Word had spread about his craftsmanship, and he found himself busier than ever, grateful for the work that kept his hands moving and his mind focused. Each finished piece felt like a small victory, a tangible sign that he was capable of creating something strong and beautiful from the wreckage of his life. One afternoon, as he was loading a finished cabinet into his truck for delivery, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he was surprised to see Laura standing there, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. "Hey, James," she said with a tentative smile. Hope I'm not interrupting." James shook his head, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Not at all, Laura. What's up?" She hesitated, glancing down at the ground. "I just wanted to apologize for everything. I should have stopped. Lillian and Leo should have warned you. But I didn't, and I'm sorry." James took a deep breath, considering her words. Laura had been a part of the mess, but he could see the genuine regret in her eyes, the guilt she'd been carrying. And in that moment, he realized he no longer wanted to hold on to the anger. "It's all right, Laura," he said, his voice soft. "I can't change what happened, and neither can you. All we can do now is move forward." She looked relieved, her smile warming as she nodded. "Thank you, James. I hope you know that if you ever need anything, I'm here." They shared a quiet moment, a mutual understanding before she left, disappearing down the path back to her house. James felt a strange sense of peace, as if a final weight had been lifted. As the months continued to pass, James slowly opened himself up to new experiences, new people. He joined a local community group and even volunteered to teach woodworking at the high school's vocational program. Being around young people again brought him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time, and he found himself genuinely enjoying the role, becoming something of a mentor. One evening after class, as he was packing up his tools, a woman named Helen, the art teacher, approached him. She was new to Auburn Ridge, having moved to town the previous year. She had a warm smile, her hands splattered with paint, and an energy that seemed to brighten the room. "James, I just wanted to say, your woodworking demos have been amazing," she said, beaming. "The kids love you, you know that?" James chuckled, feeling a rare warmth in his chest. "They're a good group. It's been a while since I've done anything like this, but I'm glad to help." Helen leaned against the doorway, looking at him with a curious tilt of her head. "You know, I'm organizing an art show in town. We're having local artists showcase their work. I was wondering if you'd be interested in showing some of your pieces." James felt a twinge of hesitation. He'd never thought of his woodworking as art before, but Helen's enthusiasm was infectious. "I'll think about it," he said, smiling. Over the next few weeks, Helen kept inviting him to events and exhibitions, introducing him to other people in town he hadn't met before. Slowly, James found himself drawn into a new social circle, people who shared his love for creating, for making something meaningful with their hands. One evening after a community gathering, Helen invited him out for a coffee, and they spent hours talking about life, art, and the path they'd both taken to get here. He learned she'd come to Auburn Ridge after a messy divorce, hoping for a fresh start just as he had. They shared stories, laughter, and even a few quiet moments that felt deeper than simple friendship. For the first time in a long time, James felt something stir in his heart, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he could open himself up again. As winter turned to spring, James found himself spending more time with Helen. They took long walks through town, discussing everything from art to family to their dreams for the future. Their friendship blossomed into something more, a gentle romance that took both of them by surprise. But it wasn't just Helen who was helping him move forward. James had also mended things with his daughter, Emily, and his son, Matthew, finding solace in their support and understanding. They had all gone through the pain of the family's upheaval, but together they were rebuilding, stronger and more resilient than before. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sun set over the quiet town, Emily turned to him, a warm smile on her face. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You've been through so much, but you've come out of it better." James felt a swell of gratitude, squeezing her hand. "Thank you, sweetheart. I don't think I could have done it without you and Matthew." She chuckled, nudging him playfully. "And maybe a little bit of Helen?" James laughed, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in years. "Yeah, maybe a little." As the months continued, James found himself fully immersed in his new life. His work, his family, and his budding relationship with Helen brought him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't thought possible after everything he'd been through. One day, while helping Helen set up for an art show, he looked around the room, taking in the vibrant colors, the laughter, and the energy of the people around him. It struck him then this was what he had been missing. Not just love or companionship, but a life filled with purpose, with connection, with hope. When the show ended that night, Helen took his hand as they walked through the empty gallery, her eyes shining with pride. "I have to say, your pieces were the star of the show." He smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond words. "Thank you, Helen. I never thought I'd be here. But I'm glad I am." She squeezed his hand, and they continued their walk, side by side, into the future. In the years that followed, James built a new life in Auburn Ridge, surrounded by friends, family, and the love he found with Helen. The memories of his past remained, but they no longer held power over him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he had come, of the strength he discovered within himself. James had once thought his life was over, shattered beyond repair, but he'd have found a way to rebuild, to grow, and to move forward. And as he stood on his porch, watching the sun set over the town he called home, he knew he finally found peace. The past was behind him, and the future lay open, full of promise. And for the first time in years, James was ready to embrace it, one day at a time.